Hello. Tuesday night. I'm in the Magic Library. Anyone out there ready to listen to stories? If so, check in, say hi, let us know where you're from. Hey, Catherine. Mitzi, hi. Beth, Charles, good to see you. So trying to find out where we left off last night. Hey, Glenda, Chris, Diane, good to see you. So hope everyone had a good day today. Becky, Marty, welcome back. Hey, Mike. So if you're checking in, say hi, let people know where you're from. City, state, if you're from out of country, let us know. Let us know what you're drinking as well. I had a nice little surprise today. I went out on my front porch and someone had brought a bottle of Angel's Envy. So thanks, Matt Sweeney, for leaving that. He also left a little Jägermeister Chaser. This is one of my favorites. And look, he gave me a little single serving size. Little tiny Jägermeister. For me, this is a single serving, by the way. All right, hey, Debbie, Michelle, hi, Amanda, Bonnie, Margie. So, everyone got their bourbon? Let people know what you're drinking. Pam, hey, Lori. So, I'm doing Angel's Envy tonight, so cheers. Yeah, Marty, that's right, where we left off last night. I had just gone over to the witch's tree, and I turned around to go home, and on the sidewalk, I was confronted by a large, hairy beast. So that's where we're going to resume tonight, see what the large hairy beast was. Okay, so the last line of our previous chapter, I stood there for a minute and listened to the sounds of the neighborhood. Then I turned to go, but I found myself face to face with a huge beast covered in black hair. All right. Hey, Laura. So we're going to go on. The next chapter then is Big Voodoo Day. So I passed a plate of poached salmon with saffron potato salad to Laura and then served another for Beth. The weather was nice, so the Tuesday night dinner club was eating outside on the back deck. "You're kidding me," said Beth. She took the plate and placed it in front of her. After pouring a bit of white wine, she passed the plate to Skippy. It was a guy in a gorilla suit? At 5 a.m, Wendy had finished her glass of wine and poured another. David McHugh and Ramon were sitting next to the pool, their bare feet soaking in the cool water. Rocky, Bess, and Fritz sat at my feet and looked longingly up at the table. "Yeah," I said, but it wasn't really a gorilla suit. It was more like Sasquatch. I grabbed a yeast roll, broke it open, and smeared it with soft butter. "Remember that movie, Harry and the Hendersons?" I said. "About the family who takes Bigfoot home to live with them?" "Oh, the one with John Lithgow?" said Laura. "Yeah, that one," I said. The guy I ran into was dressed up like that thing, kind of, goofy grin and all. "What was he doing out so late in a monkey suit?" Beth picked up Bess and sat her on her lap. "Well, it was some frat guy from the University of Louisville." I laughed and shook my head. "He said they had been having a costume party and he wanted to swing by and scare his girlfriend because she wouldn't go with him. She lives in the apartment by the witch's tree." "Did you ask if he knew Josephine?" Skippy unrolled a checkered napkin and put it in his lap. I helped myself to asparagus salad. "Well, it's a good thing he was wearing a heavy costume, though, because Fritz bit him in the leg. I had to pry him off." "Good boy." Wendy reached down and scratched the dog's head. Then, when she thought I wasn't looking, she snuck him half a yeast roll. "See what happens when you wander the streets of old Louisville in the middle of the night?" said Ramon from the side of the pool. The middle of the night?" said Skippy, pushing his glasses up on his nose. "You see that stuff down here any time of day, especially in this part of the neighborhood." "Yeah," I said, "you've got a point there." But I took a drink of wine and sat back in my chair. "But did I tell you I saw a wild turkey running down the street as well, that very same night?" "I'm surprised someone over at 4th and Crazy hasn't captured it yet and roasted over a barrel fire for a Thanksgiving dinner," said Skippy. Beth laughed and took a bite of roll. "You've got some funny people at that corner, but it's hardly bad enough that you'd find bums warming their hands over barrel fires," she said. "In any case, they make the neighborhood all the more interesting." "Not that you need to go in search of interesting things," said Laura. "Weird stuff happens to you all the time anyway," she said, spearing a bit of food with her fork. "Like your voodoo day today." "I guess," I said, thinking back to that day's events. It sure was a strange one today. I had known it was going to be a weird day as I lay in bed that morning, dreamily looking at the window. I was mentally preparing myself to get up and go to the gym when I saw something scuttle along the windowsill. I lifted my head and saw it was a little salamander, warming itself on the early morning sun. At least I thought it was a salamander, with its large head and all. There are little lizards and such in Louisville, but you rarely see salamanders. Up to that point, I had only heard about them, though, and I certainly had never seen one crawl up to the second floor in any case. Just then, an owl swooped down out of nowhere in broad daylight, snatched up the salamander, and flew away. There are owls in old Louisville, but I hadn't ever seen one of those up to that point either. I thought they only came out at night. Just then, 3 bats fluttered by. A voodoo day had begun. Hey, Beverly and Wendy and Ernesto and Missy. So feeling sorry for the salamander, I put on my gym clothes and I jogged to the YMCA down at the corner of 2nd and Chestnut. After my workout, I walked home down 3rd Street, and as I passed the Spalding University Library, I felt drawn to one of the shrubs next to the sidewalk. Don't ask me why, but I felt the need to look behind one of the bushes. And what was waiting behind that particular shrub? A huge duck kind of bird, the likes of which I had never seen before, nor have seen since. It was that ducky kind of brownish gray that most ducks in this part of the country tend to be, but it had an eerie silver sheen to it. It also had a beautiful metallic green ring around its neck. And not only that, it had a large metallic ring outlined in black around its left eye only. It was scarily exotic looking and reminded me in shape of dodo birds I had seen in old textbooks at school. When it saw me, it serenely looked up and said, "Wook," in a very nonchalant manner. "Wook." I returned the greeting and went home. And people always ask me if I was doing drugs or I was drunk at the time. No, I was not. I actually saw this bird, all right? So, hey, Sharon. Hey, Dawn. All right, so by the time I reached the front door of my house, I was convinced that I had accidentally discovered a previously extinct species of bird, so I grabbed my camera and decided to return to the scene to document my find. And remember, this was 20 years ago, so we didn't have, our cell phones with cameras on them. We had to go get our little digital cameras. That was all the rage back then. So I went home, grabbed my camera, but before I grabbed Fritz and jumped into the car, I succumbed to my desire for something sweet and got one of the huge 4-pound bags of peanut M&Ms I had given Ramon for Christmas out of the cupboard. I opened a new bag, reached in, and pulled out a handful of peanut M&Ms, all 22 of which were green. Now, I know there's a math project there somewhere, but I figure the probability of a person reaching into a brand new bag of peanut M&Ms and pulling out 22 of the same color M&M, peanut or plain, has to be astronomically high. For a minute, I wondered if those particular M&Ms might be cursed in some way or other, but in the end, my sweet tooth won over, and I ate all 22 of them on the way to the car. So I parked down by Spalding University, and Fritz and I went to find the bird. But when I looked for it behind the same bush, it was gone. It wasn't behind any of the other bushes I checked either. And to my recollection, Fritz and I checked behind every single shrub at Spalding University. Since I was out and about and feeling dejected for losing the bird, I grabbed a venti decaf ice latte from Starbucks and decided to drive around a bit and go to the West End and check out the old Auerbacher Mansion, one of my favorite spooky old homes ever at the corner of 17th and Jefferson. I really need to go home and start baking and cooking for the reception scheduled for the dedication of the historical marker they were erecting in front of Whitmer House the next day. But I soon found myself at a stoplight on 9th Street. With the window down and the driver's side of my black Sable open, I was enjoying the warm day while Fritz perched in my lap and stuck his head outside. But when I turned my head to the right, I almost had a heart attack. There, in the other lane, was a tall, blond man in a black Sable with a silver schnauzer in his lap. Like me, he wore a white tank top. Oblivious to the 1 in a million chance encounter at his side, he stared straight ahead while petting the dog. I eventually couldn't stand it any longer, so I tapped the horn and watched the guy's face as he turned and beheld his mirror image to the left. I scrunched down so he could see me through the passenger side window and spread out both my hands, palms turned up, as if to say, "What are the chances of this?" And at first the guy smiled, but then he looked like he got a bit creeped out. He raised his window and sped off as soon as the light changed, but not before I saw him reach down and lift the straw of a plastic Starbucks cup to his lips. Since it was a voodoo day, I knew it had to be a latte, but I wasn't sure if it was decaf or not. Since Beth had arrived late, I gave her a quick recap of the strange things that had happened during the day, and she said, "Of course it was a decaf," laughing as I finished the story about my doppelganger and the black car. We finished the main course, and I stacked the plates and carried them inside to the kitchen, where dessert was waiting. However, when I opened the back door and entered the sun-washed room, a ghastly sight met my eyes. And that's the end of that chapter. Okay? Yeah, that's right, Dorothy. That was a Holland tax place, the Auerbacher Mansion. And back then it was abandoned and falling apart, but since then they've restored it and fixed it up, so it's apartments now, if I remember correctly. But yeah, if you know the Conrad Caldwell House on St. James Court, they think the same guy who designed that designed the Auerbacher Mansion. It's a beautiful place. Okay, so that's our first chapter. So welcome. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks again to Matt Sweeney for providing me with a nice bottle of Angel's Envy tonight. So cheers. I'm going to wet my whistle before we go on to the next chapter. And I hope you all had a good day. Cool weather is back, and I love cool weather. I don't know about the rest of you, but I prefer cold over hot, so I'm in my element. Okay, so now we will continue with the next chapter, and the name of the chapter kind of gives things away, but oh well. As you might have discovered already, there's lots of animals in this story. And this next chapter is called Squirrels. All right? Squirrels. Remember, I was coming in the back door and I walked into the kitchen. All of a sudden, I saw something terrible. Squirrels. I felt a wave of nausea sweep up from my stomach and wash over my face. Oh no. Undulations of dizziness pulsed down from my temples and threatened to topple me. So terrible was the scene before me. I made for the nearest chair and sat. "What is it?" asked Ramon. He had picked up the dirty serving dishes and followed me into the kitchen. "Oh no," I moaned and leaned back to calm myself. "What's wrong? You look like you're having a heart attack. Stop being such a hobo." Oh, by the way, when Ramon calls me a hobo, we drink, okay? So cheers, hobo. So Ramon said, "Stop being such a hobo." My extended finger pointed in the direction of the disaster, toward the beautiful tray of desserts I'd come in to retrieve. But the ornately decorated cakes and pastries I had baked earlier that afternoon, some were for the reception the following day, some I had set aside for dessert for the Tuesday night dinner club, were gone. My shoulders sagged, and I gave my most valiant effort to remain conscious. Ramon looked at me. It was obvious he was having a hard time comprehending the scene of devastation in his field of vision. Nothing but scattered, random crumbs and bits of violated strawberry. lay strewn about the silver platters I had so carefully assembled earlier that day. On the floor nearest the counter lay upside-down lemon tartlets and miniature carrot cakes. What happened? Limply, I raised my hand again and pointed to the counter under the cupboard, where we kept wine glasses and crystal stemware. There, in the same spot the rat had pilfered my sugar babies from the silver bowl, stood a fat-cheeked squirrel, greedily nibbling on a chocolate petit four. It was so engrossed in its gluttony that it hadn't even noticed us come into the kitchen. Hey, get out of here! Ramon quickly grabbed a rag mop and shooed the critter off the counter and started chasing it around the house. Instead of running out the back door, though, the squirrel chattered its displeasure and scampered off to the dining room. I told you not to be a hobo and leave those windows open. Ramon looked back and gave me a dirty look. You call me a hobo again. So, cheers. I got up from the chair and went to grab a whisk broom and dustpan. Underfoot, I smashed sticky crumbs and half-eaten cakes that had been scattered about. Slowly, I swept up the pieces and formed a little pile near the trash can. I gathered up the empty trays and stacked them on the table in the middle of the kitchen. I'd be up all night baking replacements. Hey, what's all the fuss about? Laura had entered and surveyed the damage. Oh my, what happened here? Her eyes widened as she spotted the mess on the floor. Did you drop something? I shook my head. A squirrel got in and destroyed all my sweets for the neighborhood reception tomorrow, I said, reaching out for the broom behind the door. Looks like we won't be having dessert tonight. The reception for the historical marker they're putting in front of the house? Oh, that's a shame, she said. Here, said Skippy, walking through the back door. He handed me a folded piece of paper and scowled at the mess on the floor. What's all this? Please tell me that wasn't our dessert. It was. I swept the pile of refuse into a dustpan and emptied it into the trash. Did you drop something? He said. No, the squirrel did it. I put the broom away and opened the paper he had given me. What's this? I don't know. What the heck do you mean? The squirrel did it, he said. I examined the sheet of paper in my hand and saw a drawing in pencil. The squirrel on the counter ate all the cakes I made. No dessert for the Tuesday night dinner club, I said. What squirrel on the counter are you talking about? Skippy opened the refrigerator door and rummaged around for another bottle of wine. The sounds of a scuffle ensued from the back stairs, and Ramon emerged in hot pursuit, the mop cleaving the air in front of him. Chittering noisily, the rodent bounded past us and out the back door, followed by the dogs who chased it over the back fence. Ramon put the mop away behind the door and angrily shook his finger at me. I told you not to leave open the windows on the third floor. I rolled my eyes and looked at Skippy. That squirrel, I said. Oh. So the week before, I had left the 3 small windows in my office open, and the results were equally disastrous. Leaving the third floor to air out, I had gone out in the backyard and started nailing up extra fencing around the deck to prevent kids from the adjacent daycare center from getting into the pool. It was exceptionally hot that day, and I was sweating profusely. I was about to pound in the last nail when the doorbell rang at the most inopportune moment and caused me to smash my thumb. Cursing under my breath, I took my throbbing thumb to the front door and opened it. It was Uli, a neighbor down the road who had asked me to dog-sit her Westie for 2 weeks while she went back to visit her family in Germany. And she was dropping off Pumpkin. Ramon's sister and her husband were out of town as well, so we were sitting their 2 dogs also. 6 dogs in one house had the potential for pandemonium, the chances of which increased exponentially when an energetic, bushy-tailed rodent was added to the mix. I told Uli to have a good time, closed the door, and ushered Pumpkin into the back part of the house, where canine acquaintances would be made. I was surprised that the other dogs hadn't accompanied me to the front of the house, though, when the loud buzzer sounded, and as I walked into the butler's pantry, I saw why. All 5 of them had crowded around a small wine cooler that stood in the corner, their gazes intent on something I couldn't see, something they had been chasing, something which now sought refuge in the small space along the baseboards. I pushed my way through the herd of dogs and peered out into the void behind the wine cooler. Two beady little eyes looked up at me, and the squirrel issued a shrill rebuke at me, perhaps for having enticed it through the open windows upstairs in the first place. I turned around and beheld 6 sets of eyes ready for a chase. Spurred on by some act of doggy telepathy, Pumpkin had scented the squirrel and raised her front paw as her tail boinged out straight behind her. Uli obviously had forgotten to tell her she was not a pointer. With Rocky, Bess, and Fritz quivering in their spots and Melvin and Mia inching ever closer, I decided to first corral the dogs and then help the squirrel find its way out. But as I reached for the first of the pups, the squirrel emerged from its hiding spot and took a perch on the little television set atop the wine cooler. After another chattering reproach, the animal surveyed the opposition and bounded over the pack, landing at the threshold to the dining room. It scuttled across the hardwood floors, its tiny rodent nails clawing and clattering wildly, and the dogs were off and running. Up the front stairs, down the hall to the small room at the back of the house, then back out and down around the second set of stairs to the butler's pantry, the squirrel managed to stay ahead of the dogs. Then it ran through the dining room again and followed the stairs all the way to the 3rd floor, where it bounded through the guest suite and into my office, right past the window that had afforded it egress. It scrambled up the curtains and took up a position on top of my bookcase, and then leaped through the air and landed in the bowl of the large stained glass light fixture suspended from the middle of the ceiling, where it swirled around several times before nails clicked up the sides and an angry head popped out over the rim. As I caught up to the dogs, who had all remained silent to that point, they began barking, and the squirrel hurled itself from the light shade to the landing outside my office, and it bounced up into the drapes on the nearest window. The curtain rod came crashing to the ground with the drapes, and the squirrel emerged from the mound of fabric, shot up, and rode the railing down to the next landing. Thanks to the mound of drapery that slowed down the dogs in the middle of the stairs, I made it to the bottom floor ahead of them and was able to lock the squirrel in the front parlor while I rounded up the dogs and secured them in a bedroom with the door tightly closed. Hey, Carrie. Hey, Beverly. When I returned to the parlor and opened the doors, the squirrel was nowhere to be seen. Had it escaped through the fireplace and out the chimney? Hopeful, I approached the mantel for further inspection. The squirrel, however, was still in the room and had sought refuge under a slight wrinkle in the Persian rug, a fact I discovered while walking to the fireplace. I inadvertently stepped on the animal's tail and sent it shooting out from under the carpet. It then embarked on a whirlwind course of the room, knocking over end tables and lamps in its frenzied lamps along the baseboard. After the 3rd circuit, it clawed its way up to the drapes at the front window and scurried along the curtain rod before it dislodged and fell to the floor. The squirrel jumped to the top edge of the mantelpiece and scurried along, knocking off a large framed picture, which then landed on top of my favorite American bell ache vase and smashed it. Finally, I flung open the parlor doors and let the squirrel have free rein of the house. An hour later, and after several downed curtain rods, 3 broken lamps, 2 smashed pictures, and sundry pieces of bric-a-brac in varying degrees of disrepair, it finally found its way out the back door and scampered across the backyard. The next time I left the windows open on the 3rd floor, I did so with the confidence that the chances of something that crazy happening again were next to 0. Remembering the piece of paper Skippy had given me, I looked down and saw a rough pencil sketch of a gypsy woman scrying a crystal ball. Somehow, the rendering looked vaguely familiar. Where had I seen it before? Underneath the drawing, something was written. "So what's this all about?" I said to Skippy. "I don't know." He opened the door and headed outside with the wine. I rummaged around in the refrigerator and put together a plate with cheese and fresh fruit. Then I followed him out and sat at the table with the others, and some of them jumped into the pool. "You're the one who gave it to me, so why don't you know what it is?" "Well, I don't know what it is. It was folded into a paper airplane that came sailing over the fence." Did you see who threw it? I sat straight up and tried to see over the fence into the next lot. Nope, he said. I heard someone say I was supposed to give it to you, and then they scampered away. Me? I wonder if it was Louis or Frederick. They always seem to be hanging around looking for some extra work. They never come to the front door. I don't think so, said Skippy. Those two know your name, but this person said, give it to the tall blonde guy, like they didn't know your name. From the voice, I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. I turned the piece of paper over in my hand. I smoothed the creased paper out on the table and studied it again. That's weird, I said. Studying the figure drawn there, I immediately thought about the woman named Neptuna, and I wondered if she had delivered the indecipherable message. Quickly, I ruled out that possibility, since she couldn't have known where I lived, not to mention I had told her my name. Not only that, she said they were leaving earlier that very next morning. It was probably just another oddball in old Louisville, said Wendy. Or maybe it was Josephine, said Beth. I couldn't rule out either of these options, so I shrugged my shoulders and passed around and poured more glasses of wine. First, it's a voodoo woman. Then I find out there are witches here. Now it's gypsies. What's next? Werewolves and vampires? Is that what's in the drawing there? A werewolf or a vampire? Skippy pointed to the paper I had smoothed out on the table and twisted his neck to get a better view. No, that's the thing, I said. It's a picture of a gypsy, I think. I pointed to the script under the picture, and there's something written here in a foreign language. I can't make it out, though. I studied the writing and squinted. Well, I'll snoop around and see what I can find out, but it's not like anything I've seen before. I grabbed another large strawberry and bit into it. I want to go to the library tomorrow anyway and see what I can dig up about gypsies in this area. Maybe I'll uncover something interesting. The sun slowly disappeared behind the canopy of large trees, and darkness soon enveloped the backyard. Across the pool, I watched as two shadowy forms scampered along the top of the fence. Eyeing me suspiciously, they jumped up into the nearest tree, found a low-hanging utility wire, and then tight-roped their way over the table and onto the back roof of the house. Without looking back, they chittered their excitement to each other and bounded over the steep peaks and gables of La Casa Fabulosa. So that's the end of that chapter. So you're all hanging in there, still ready for more? Our next chapter looks like 4.5 pages. I think we could probably do this and maybe another chapter. I don't know. We'll see. So welcome. Thanks again for tuning in tonight. Good to see all the regulars back. We're going on over like 2.5 weeks now. See some new faces tonight. So say hi. Let people know where you're from. City, state. If you're out of the country, let us know. We love out-of-country visitors. Let us know what you're drinking. I'm doing Angel's Envy tonight, thanks to Matt Sweeney, who gave me a little gift this afternoon. And anything else you want to tell us, just let us know. So if you've been here from the beginning, you know that we started off several weeks ago by me telling stories from my 11th book, True Ghost Stories and Eerie Legends from America's Most Haunted Neighborhood. And those 10 nights, I just kind of told the stories as I knew them, because these are part of the nightly tours we do in Old Louisville, America's Most Haunted Neighborhood. Normally, 7:30 at night, I'm out on the streets, taking people around, showing them the neighborhood, talking about the architecture, talking about the great haunted history down there. But since we're in quarantine, the next best thing is to get people together and just tell stories and talk about the neighborhood while we're trying to pass the time. So Louisville Historic Tours is the company. We're really excited for things to be ending soon and having people come down and see us, and for us to be able to show people around. Usually 90% of the time I'm around, I can take people around myself, but if not, I got my couple trusty friends, Susan or Kelly, who can take people around as well. Deborah, who's an old Louisville icon. She knows a lot about the history down there. She helps me out as well. But if I can, I love to go down there and show people around myself, because a lot of these stories come from the books I've written from the neighborhood. So a couple nights ago, well, a week ago, we ran out of stories from that book. So we started reading my memoir, Voodoo Days, at La Casa Fabulosa, my very last book, which talks about the supposedly haunted house I lived in. So if you get a chance, go on Amazon.com or Goodreads or Barnes & Noble. Give us some stars. Thanks, by the way, for all the people who've gone on and given us nice reviews. Giving a 5-star review to an author is like better than gold. I mean, the 5 minutes it takes for you to go online and do something like that, you just don't know how much an author appreciates it. So thanks to you, Lisa, for example, and Abby. I saw your beautiful reviews, so thanks for doing that. If you're on TripAdvisor, go to Louisville Historic Tours and give us a nice review on that as well, because everything we're talking about comes from our tours that are on TripAdvisor as well. But if you haven't checked out our website, Louisville Historic Tours, go check it out. My friend Sean Stafford, Hunley Media, they've done a lot of great work. We got all this merchandise kind of slowly trickling out, and this was the year we were going to kind of really go crazy. And then, of course, all this stuff happened with the quarantine, so we got all this stuff. I was ready to roll out March 15th when this tour season started, and quarantine and all this stuff happened, so everything's just kind of on a hold. But we're all dealing with the same thing, so we're not going to feel sorry for ourselves. We're all doing as good as we can, and I know you're doing as good as you can as well. So can't wait for another month or two till this is all over and you can come and see us in old Louisville and help us promote the neighborhood. But let's go ahead and continue our next chapter. So if you've been tuning in every night, you've been finding out there were witches in old Louisville. We got gypsies, voodoo people, all these things we didn't really know about. And so this next chapter is the one where I found out some interesting information that substantiates the claims about Louisville's position as a gypsy headquarters back in the day. So this one is called Jack and the Gypsy Wedding. And remember, this is the day after the squirrels ravished all my my sweets in the kitchen. So after very little sleep, I got up the next morning around 6 and took the dogs for a walk. Several loud booms had woken me up in the middle of the night, but instead of getting up to inspect, I lay in bed and worried about the things I had to do to get ready for the day. Although groggy, I was happy that I managed to recreate all the items the squirrels had violated. Fortunately, all the canapes and savories had been safely stashed in the refrigerator, so I only had to worry about baking a new batch of cakes and tarts. As we strolled through the quiet neighborhood, I mentally went over the preparations still needed to get the house in shape for the dedication ceremony and reception later that day. Patches of fog clung to the dewy grass in Central Park as we crossed into St. James Court and passed the fountain splashing at its center. On the green, a net had been set up and 2 couples were playing an early morning round of badminton. It was only after strolling by them I recalled that they were all dressed in white and in what appeared to be casual wear from the early 1900s. The guys wore pleated trousers and sweater vests, and the women had on long skirts, blouses, and brimmed hats. Why were people up so early playing badminton? And why were they dressed like that? I shook my head and let the dogs lead me on. At the Pink Palace, we turned left and followed one of the walkways through Belgravia Court, which glowed softly in the early morning flicker of the gas lamps. On 4th Street, I tied the dogs up outside the old Louisville coffee house and went inside for a latte. When I came outside, I found an elderly gentleman stooping down to pet the dogs. He said his name was Jack, and we soon got to talking about the neighborhood. As it turned out, as a young man, he had lived in one of the houses I had been researching on 6th Street, and he proved to be a wealth of information. And for those of you who remember about the night I talked about the Jenny Cassidy Infirmary for Women, this is the Jack who lives in that apartment. This is the first time I met him. Oh, those were the days back then when I was a kid in the 20s and 30s, he said. A faraway look settled in his bright eyes. The neighborhood was still hopping then, that's for sure. Well, I heard there were gangsters and everything back then, I said. Oh, there certainly was. Capone used to come to town and meet with his bootleg associates, and a number of those big old places were converted into speakeasies. He raised a hand and pointed a finger toward a large mansion down the street. You know, I said, I had heard there were gypsies and voodoo queens and witches back then. You remember anything about them? Oh, we did hear stories about witches and the voodoo doctors, but I don't know my first-hand experiences with them count as anything, he said. But there were a lot of wealthy merchants moving up from New Orleans who used to live down by the river in the big mansions on what was known as Frenchman's Row. That was in the point. So it'd hardly be surprising that voodoo made its way up here now, would it? He scratched his head slowly and looked off into the distance at something unseen. What about gypsies? I said. Now, gypsies, that's something I do recall seeing. His eyes squinted and his head moved up and down. When I was a young kid, you'd see them passing through town on occasion, looking for tinkering work or reading fortunes and things like that. They used to drive those big covered wagons like you see in the movies. Well, that must have been a sight, I said. Oh, yeah, it was. A slight frown creased his face, but you know, people didn't trust gypsies back then, or now for that matter, because they thought they were all pickpockets and thieves. They dressed exactly like you saw in the movies, too. The women had long skirts, dark skirts, and the men, they wore these embroidered vests and leather boots up to their knees sometimes. A squirrel skittered along a branch overhead, and the dogs tersed their leads. I wondered if it was the relative of one that had raided the house the day before. You used to see their encampments down along the river at the point when they were passing through town. There'd be big bonfires and celebrations with lots of dancing and music. No kidding. I pulled the dog closer and made ready to leave. That's fascinating, I said. It's amazing how much of the past has been forgotten. Right you are. He patted the dogs, and as I turned to go, Jack gave me one last piece of advice. Watch out for those voodoo queens. Smiling to myself, I let the dogs tug me along and followed them home. Once they were fed and watered, I grabbed my things and headed to the library. I was determined to learn about gypsies in Kentucky. This time, I hoped to finally get some research done. Given that the main branch of the Louisville Library has been known to attract its fair share of weirdos, I should have not been surprised when Cookie jumped out at me from behind the microfiche files as I headed to the clippings collection. Wanted that? Give me that, some of that cookies? He gave me a big grin and a wink. Hello, I said. I'm still not sure what you're saying, but there aren't any cookies at the library. Not gonna give me that, some of that, one of that cookies? An indignant look turned his upside down grin. I tried to push past him, but he wouldn't budge, so I backed up and pointed to the cookbook section. Why don't you check out a book on baking? There you can make all your own cookies. Don't want them cookies, he said. Want them cookies here. Gotta run. I faked a movement to the left and dodged around to the right. At the end of the stack, I picked up my pace and retreated to the relative safety of the audiobook section. Keeping watch from a distance, I returned to the newspaper clipping when the coast was clear. The newspaper clipping section of the library consisted of an entire row of stacks with hundreds of old green cardboard boxes full of newspaper articles that had been cut and pasted onto sheets of construction paper. And from the looks of it, it was a project undertaken in the 1940s or thereabouts. Files from Kentucky and Louisville that cover a wide variety of topics line the shelves, and I still tend to go there as a first line of defense when starting a local research project. Last time I went, they weren't there anymore, so we're talking about 20 years ago now, just so you know. But that day I slowly worked my way through the titles on the yellowed labels along the spine of each box, and sure enough, after several minutes, I located a box with gypsies as a category. I pulled it from the shelf and sat down at the nearest carol. Although there was only a single article about gypsies in the files, the one I found was extremely revealing. It ran in the Courier Journal on July 10th, 1938, and it was in the title author that we found out Oressa Teagarden had written it, and she described the situation as gypsy headquarters without any gypsies, in quotes. Below the headline, a teaser read, "Never before this year did they fail to show up in Louisville where they still have their money and lawyers," end quote. Intrigued, I read on. So this is all quote. Once the favorite camping ground for the nomads, Louisville was the scene of every gypsy ceremonial. Conventions, weddings, births, divorces, burials, feast days brought the clans together on the point each summer. Families huddled together in cramped winter lodgings, eking out an existence while they longed for spring and the open road again. End quote. So it was true. Louisville had at one time indeed been a hub of gypsy activity in this country. The reason for this was explained thusly, and going to another quote. Conveniently located between the north and the south, Louisville offered ideal camping grounds, and the bands were found here annually. They remained several weeks in summer, many on their way to the north from Mexico or the southern states, and they came together for Easter ceremonies. Leaving the cold northern climate after Thanksgiving, they were again in Louisville 2 or 3 weeks before continuing their journey to the south, end quote. In addition, gypsy history was made here in years past. In its making, the gypsies became involved in court actions. The time had come when they were, for some unaccountable reason, unable to agree within their organization. Attorneys who pleaded their cases before the courts and guardians who helped them make their customs conform in some measure to law became their friends, end quote. However, going back to the quotes, as they gradually gave up the city as a temporary dwelling place, they at the same time retained contacts with those who had aided them. Thus, Louisville remained gypsy headquarters in legal and business affairs, end quote. Those who had aided them were Clem Huggins, an attorney, and Ben Johnson, their administrator and guardian. The grounds for their giving up the city as a dwelling place was attributed to increased police pressure, the article said, which apparently had left a bad taste in the gypsies' mouths. Although the lengthy piece went on to describe local gypsy customs and appearance, as well as make a number of observations that would be today regarded as politically incorrect at best, for example, detesting most necessary contacts with Gentiles except to pick their pockets, they have clung desperately to the 2 men in Louisville who have been their friends. The gist of the article expressed a sense of wonderment that the gypsies had quit Louisville. As far as nomads were concerned, it appeared that a number of American gypsies had significant ties to Louisville. Rummaging through microfilmed editions of the local papers from the late 1800s and early 1900s, I found various references to gypsy bands when they passed through town, but not much more than that. After getting online and doing some sleuthing, though, I then discovered that gypsies had actually resided in Louisville as well. Much of this came from articles that ran in papers across the country in late April 1929, in which it was reported that hundreds of gypsies were en route to Louisville for a gypsy royal wedding. In addition to those traveling to Kentucky, some 200 gypsies of the same tribe who lived in town planned on attending the festivities as well. As it turned out, the bride-to-be hailed from the Derby City. The Atlanta Constitution reported that Rosie Stanley, 16, the daughter of William Stanley of Louisville, would marry 17-year-old Frank John, the son of Chief Gregory John of Philadelphia. Back to quotes. Both are members of the John tribe, and the tribe is expected to congregate en masse for the ceremonies, it said. Then, going back to quotes, the wedding will take place in a 3-acre field near the Ohio River. And pigs, turkeys, and chickens were being roasted all over town for the feasts. An orchestra from Cincinnati has been engaged to play continuously for the first 24 hours of celebration. There followed a breakdown of the festivities, with the feast starting at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and dancing from 8, quote, until everyone is too tired to continue. Then, the next morning, there would be dancing from 9 until 4 in the afternoon, at which time another feast would be taking place. At this feast, Prince John, with much ceremony, would pay Stanley an agreed-upon fee of $2,700 for his daughter, and a marriage by magistrate would complete the wedding the next day. End quote. However, whether the wedding actually took place remains unclear because 2 days later, on April 28th, national newspapers such as the New York Times wrote, in quotes, "Gypsy wedding off, Louisville puzzled." Some say bride's father insisted on $300 more for his daughter's hand. Others hint at police. Anyhow, police Hendrik John fails to win Rosetta and band starts for Chicago. End quote. The discrepancy in the names most likely is attributable to the fact that gypsies used two sets of names. The first line of the article read, "A band of gypsies led by Chief John and his son, Prince Hendrik John, went trekking out of Louisville in high dudgeon today, and the city will not witness a royal wedding in Romany." However, instead of caravan of old, most of them left in high-powered cars. So the author went on to say that the father of the bride had said that the ceremony would take place in Chicago instead, where the people are more hospitable and where more gypsies can gather to engage in festivities worthy of the weddings of one of royal blood. End quote. It was also rumored that the police had not welcomed the chief and his followers with open arms, and pestering by sightseers and curiosity seekers had caused the gypsies to depart. Sources close to the bridal party, however, appeared to corroborate the claim that the bride's father had just upped the price at the last moment, and that was the cause of the problem. When asked whether $3,000 wasn't a lot to pay for a wife, Ruby, the would-be bridegroom's sister, replied, "Not for a good woman. My husband's father, he paid $4,000 for me. For my wedding, they rent a hall in New York. There was maybe 400 people there. Everyone got drunk and the police arrest 43. The next day, they fine everybody $1, whether they just drunk or killed somebody." But as the reporter pointed out, the price for gypsy wives must vary widely. Tessa, another sister, brought only $4 in a collar button in the marriage market. I glanced at the clock on the wall and I realized I'd been in the library for most of the morning. I had to get home and get ready for the reception. So I quickly gathered up my belongings and ran to return the box of dusty clippings to its place on the shelf. However, as I turned around to head for the exit, an angry figure stood in my way. It was Josephine. Cliffhanger. Should we stop there? Let me see. Next chapter. 1, 2. Oh. Yeah. If you're up for it, I can read a couple more pages. Yeah, I can do another 10 or 9 pages. Yeah, if you're all up for it. All right. Well, cheers. I gotta wet my whistle. Once again, thanks to Matt Sweeney for the nice bottle of Angel's Envy. I have 7 minutes, Charles? Okay, well, I'll try to get it in 7 minutes. So once again, if you're just checking in, say hi, tell people where you're from, say how you know me. A lot of people, my Facebook friends, I remember, but every once in a while there's someone I was like, I don't know who that person is, and I was like, oh, you were a student of mine, or you came on a tour, so let people know how you know me, and let us know what you're drinking tonight. So, all right, the next chapter is pretty short. It's like only 2 pages, and then there's another 3 pages, so we'll try, I think we can do the next 2 chapters. Yeah. So, the next chapter is Kentucky Voodoo. All right. So remember, I was at the library, and who was there standing at the door? Josephine. Wearing a tightly wound green turban on her head, Josephine seemed taller than the last time I had seen her. Her yellow blouse had a wide lacy collar, and her cream-colored skirt seemed to have an iridescent pattern stamped over the fabric. At her throat, a large gold medallion dangled from a necklace of turquoise beads. A nerve in my left shoulder started to twitch as I met the gaze of her cold black eyes, and I prepared myself for the worst. Then, with a hint of impatience, she arched her eyebrow at me, and slowly I nodded my head, a silent signal to let her know that I would not offer any resistance. Again, her eyebrow lifted, and her head jerked to the side in an impatient shrug. What was she trying to communicate? Should I say something? Finally, she rolled her eyes in exasperation and threw up her hands. "Do you mind to let me pass?" she demanded. Suddenly, I found my voice, and I moved out of the way. "Oh," I said, "I'm sorry." She breezed past me and went down the space between the bookshelves in the far end. Apparently, she didn't recognize me from our previous encounters, or else she had forgiven my transgressions, whatever they were. Emboldened by an unexpected sense of curiosity, I went after her. I followed her up the stairs, carefully trying to stay out of sight, and she eventually made her way to the botany section. Was she in search of strange plants to use in her voodoo rituals? Soundlessly, I took a position in the back aisle next to hers, and I peered through the gap over the row of books in front of me. From a pocket in the front of her skirt, Josephine pulled out a creased piece of brown paper, unfolded it, and held it out at arm's length to read. After returning it to her pocket, she walked her fingers over the vertical titles before her and stopped at a spine with a colorful pattern. As she pulled it from its tight space, I craned my neck to make out the name, but before the words came into focus, something grabbed me from behind. "Gonna get some of that cookies?" Cookie grinned at me. As I spun around and instinctively I lifted a fist. "Leave me alone! I told you already that I don't have any cookies!" I returned my attention to the crack from which I had been spying on Josephine, but she had put the book under her arm and was preparing to leave the aisle. "Hey!" Stepping up on his toes, Cookie noticed the object of my curiosity, knitted his brow in an angry furrow. "Stay away from some of that devil trick woman." He raised a finger at me and shook it in irritation. "Want to get some of that hex mama?" "Gotta run." I scooted around him and out the other end of the aisle. "Dat want to get some of that devil trick on you," he said. "Gonna get you bad." By the time I escaped, so had Josephine. And after several minutes of looking for her, I gave up and returned to the row where she had stood. I studied the gap where the book had been, and from the Dewey Decimal numbers on either side, I was able to piece together an approximate catalog number for the book Josephine had taken. I rushed to the computer, and after several minutes, I came up with the title I was looking for, Magic and Medicine of Plants. A minute later, I was out on the street, headed back home, and as I walked down 3rd Street, one thought kept rushing through my mind. Josephine really was a voodoo queen, wasn't she? By the time I arrived at my front door, all thoughts of the gypsies had fled, and I was obsessed with voodoo. But I had other things to do first. I got things ready for the reception, and soon the house was full of neighborhood people. There was a small dedication ceremony, followed by champagne and hors d'oeuvres. After everybody left, I ran upstairs and fired up the computer, and several hours later, random, surprising bits of information had surfaced, information that substantiated a voodoo presence in Kentucky. An online site dedicated to the topic explained that many carried the Laveau-inspired voodoo faith from New Orleans, first up from the Mississippi and Ohio, to river towns such as Natchez, Memphis, St. Louis, Old Vincennes, Louisville, and Cincinnati, then to places as diverse as New York, Chicago, Charleston, Savannah, St. Augustine, and San Francisco. In addition, I discovered that one of Louisiana's most famous voodoo personalities had hailed from the bluegrass state. Robert Talent, in his book Voodoo in New Orleans, wrote that Dr. Beauregard came to New Orleans from Kentucky in the year 1869. He was one of the only foreign voodoos that came to the city. He was the most amazing in appearance of all the witch doctors because he had long hair that went all the way down to his knees. He also put the hair into a number of strange knots. In the knots he carried all of the gree-grees, bottles of oils, dried reptiles, small bones, and a hoot owl's head. After scaring some ladies on the street one night, he was arrested for throwing the hoot owl's head at the police and putting curses upon them. When he was released from prison, he disappeared. Most people believe he went back to Kentucky and went looking for new fields. Although several other accounts contradicted this actual year of his arrival and arrest, the fact that a celebrated voodoo priest had lived and practiced in Kentucky seemed to be very well documented. The most surprising tidbit of all, however, turned out to be this. Apparently, the only official organization dealing with voodoo, the Voodoo Society of America, had its headquarters in Louisville. I sat back in my chair, complacent in the discoveries I had unearthed, when something odd happened. Something that made me jump. A small stone, jade green with flecks of brown and beautifully polished, landed in my lap. So that could be a cliffhanger chapter, but since you're all here, we'll do one more chapter, and then we're going to call it a night. So this one, like I said, is it's 5 pages, so we'll do this chapter and then call it a night. So once again, thanks for coming. Say hi to everyone. Glad to see all the new and old faces. Thanks, Matt Sweeney, for the Angel's Envy. And if you haven't checked out our website, Louisville Historic Tours, check it out. Give us some stars on Google. Sean Stafford's doing a lot of great work. By the way, you can check in tonight if you haven't done it already. Check in at David's. Tonight here do David's Magic Library. You can check in at David's Magic Library. You can check in at America's Most Haunted Neighborhood, Louisville Historic Tours. So, like I said, every little thing you can do to help us get the word out about the neighborhood, that's great. All right, our last chapter then for tonight. And this brings us up to about halfway through the book, actually. So, yeah, another week's 8-9 days, we're going to be done. Yeah, so the chapter tonight is called Goats. And if Lori's still listening, this is a chapter she would love. Lori Fields, okay? Hey, VG. And Veronica, see you again. So thanks, everyone. Charles, thanks for coming back, like I said. So remember, I was at the library. I found all this interesting stuff about voodoo, went home. I was up on my 3rd floor in my office, and I was at my computer, and all of a sudden this polished green stone lands in my lap, okay, out of nowhere. And then we go on to the next chapter, Goats. Goats. So I picked the stone up and turned it over. Flat and almost perfectly round, it measured an inch or so in diameter and would have been a perfect stone for skipping across the water. I had no idea of the geology that had led to its creation, but I could tell that someone had put it in a rock polisher. Where it came from was a mystery. But it appeared to be the same stone I had seen the previous night at the witch's tree. I looked at the ceiling, but there was no sign of a crack in the plaster or anything else that might have accounted for its appearance. So my mind immediately turned to the paranormal. I had read about documented cases of weirdness where strange things, including coal, frogs, and strips of meat, such as during the famous Kentucky meat shower of March 3rd, 1876, had fallen from the sky. And I now wondered if the Widmer house was spitting things at me to get my attention. Since I had been making a concerted effort to ignore the ever-increasing frequency and volume of the odd crashes and unusual groans that plagued our day-to-day existence in the large old home, it was not entirely out of the realm of possibility. However, as had been the case in all the peculiar events before happening at La Casa Fabulosa, I forced myself to look for a rational explanation before giving in to flights of fancy. I told myself it had to come from somewhere else, so I looked for points of ingress to my immediate surroundings. Right away, I trained my eyes on the only possible source of an airborne rock in the room, the bank of open windows next to my desk, where lightly fluttering curtains hinted at a soft breeze outside. I got up and walked to the window seat under the 3 open windows. I kneeled, pushed aside the flimsy curtain that partially covered the windows nearest the desk, and I stuck my head out. Below, on the walkway leading to the front door, a tall figure stood and gazed up at me. Because of the large size, I took it to be a male, and he seemed to be wearing a long, dark coat. It also looked like he had very, very long, dark hair. I must be going insane, I muttered, falling back into a sitting position on the cushions. If down there was Dr. Beauregard, the voodoo guy I had just read about, it was time to pack up and check into the loony bin. I pressed my eyes shut and willed the mysterious form away. Then I poked my head back outside and hoped for the best. But he was still there, and this time he raised a hand in greeting. Oh, this is going to be good, I thought as I righted myself up and started for the stairs. Ramon was working late again and wouldn't be back for several hours, but I wished he were there to witness the weirdness, and by default lend some credibility to the stories I would tell afterwards. Slowly, my feet followed the treads down to the foyer, where I crossed to the front door and opened it. When the man saw me emerge from the front steps, he lifted his chin in acknowledgement and came to meet me. Although he stood 1 step below me, his eyes were almost level with mine, so I assumed he had to be close to 6'6". Immediately, I breathed a sigh of relief. Dr. Beauregard was described as an older black man, and this guy was definitely white and young. And although this guy did have very long, dark hair, I was happy to see no signs of magic pouches or bones tucked away in its depths, much less dried reptiles or heads of hoot owls. Hey, you mind giving me my rock back? He held out a hand. Why would you think I have your rock? I asked. But of course he knew I had his rock because he had just pitched it through my open window and had obviously gotten my attention, which I assumed was his intent in the first place. He lifted a hand and pointed to the smooth stone that I had been worrying subconsciously between my fingers. Because you're holding it in your hand right now? His tone irked me, and I suspected that we were not going to get along. Nonetheless, I handed over the stone. Thanks, he said. Studying his size and appearance more closely, I began second-guessing my decision to come out and talk to this person, and I suddenly wished I had brought out my cell phone in case I needed to call for help, or at least the Louisville Slugger. I looked up at the patchwork arrangement of lit windows in the Hillebrand house, and I wondered if Loretti sat up in her window, keeping watch with her father's binoculars. As if someone had read my mind, the light in her window came on and off and flashed 3 times in a row. Smiling, I let out an inaudible sigh of relief. What's so funny? He followed my gaze to the upper floor of the apartment building on the other side of the street. Nothing, I said. Can I ask why you're throwing rocks through my window? You could have broken something. I crossed my arms and waited for an answer. Could have, but didn't. He crossed his arms and mustered a faint smile. Oh, so you're a good aim. What do you want? Well, I want to get your attention. A breeze skimmed across the front yard and rustled the ends of his hair. Ever hear of a doorbell? I said. I uncrossed my arms and jammed a hand into my front pants pocket. He uncrossed his arms and did the same. Yeah, but I don't believe in using them, doorbells. You don't believe in using doorbells? I said. Overhead, a roaring UPS plane seemed to skim the top of the Hillebrand house as it came in for a low landing at the airport. Nope, never have, never will. He looked up and studied the light flashing under the wings of the aircraft, with the sound receding as sunk beneath a treetop and disappeared. Well, I take it you don't like knocking either? I noticed a small pile of sticks had been left in the patch of grass to the left of the walkway. I stepped over it for a better look. It didn't appear as carefully constructed as the last mound I had found, and I wondered if Ramon had accumulated the small pile earlier that day when he was out front doing yard work. Knocking's fine, but you were up on the 3rd floor. Might not have heard me knock. He followed me to the sticks and waited. How'd you know I was up on the 3rd floor? I said. I picked up the small pile and carried it over to a small receptacle at the side of the house. He followed me. Saw the lights on, he said, and you're always up there late at night. Are you a stalker? I was getting creeped out. Overhead, as if on cue, the light to Loretti's apartment flashed on and off, on and off, on and off. No, his brow wrinkled, and an indignant look spread across his face. I'm just observant. I walk up and down 3rd Street all the time. Well, I don't know who you are or what you want, but this is kind of freaky. I gave you your stone back, so now you can be on your way. I turned to go. Hey, sorry, man, he said. I just had this story I wanted to tell you, and I know you like stories. Didn't mean to freak you out or anything. Reluctantly, I turned around and faced him. A story? The bulb in the nearest street lamp flickered once and dimmed its light. A soft yellowish glare was caught in the waxy leaves of the pitifully small hedge bushes surrounding the yard. Once again, I was reminded that it would take years for it to fill out and grow into a lush border that I wanted. Yeah, I wanted to share a story with you. He reached out a hand to shake mine. My name is Bo, and I live over on 4th Street. Bo. A weak tremor creaked my voice. Yeah, Bo. He nodded his head. Short for Beauregard. Beauregard? I said. No way. Yeah, I was born and raised in New Orleans. He opened his dark trench coat and pointed to a Bourbon Street logo across the front of his shirt. My temples started to throb, and I squeezed my eyes shut to block out the creepy images of the Kentucky voodoo doctor of the same name. The budding coincidence at hand had all the hallmarks of the beginning of a voodoo day. However, my voodoo days always started in the morning. Either I was experiencing a voodoo day that was getting off to a late start, or else we were getting a jump start on the next morning. Or, I thought to myself with trepidation, perhaps I would be experiencing my first voodoo night. You are not from New Orleans, I said. Yeah, I am, he said. Why would I make something up like that? That'd be weird. Well, the circumstances of this little encounter right here might be considered weird, I said, so it would be par for the course. I studied Bo up and down. And who goes around throwing rocks through people's windows to get their attention when there's a perfectly fine doorbell? I heard you were collecting ghost stories, he said, from the neighborhood, so I wanted to come over and see if you had heard about this one-armed woman they see floating down 4th Street. I've seen her myself. One-armed woman? I crossed my arms and raised my eyebrows. Yeah, it's real freaky. He narrowed his eyes and continued in a conspiratorial whisper. It's this old black woman with a bandana around her head. She doesn't have a left arm, and she just floats along the sidewalk like she doesn't know where she's going. I'd figure you'd know something about it already. No, I said, that's the first time I've heard about that one. So what's her name? I don't know her name. I don't know her story. But Bo flicked a strand of hair behind his ears and paused as if he'd never considered the question before. I'm not really sure what her story is, and that's why I came to you. All I've heard is that she was an old voodoo woman or something like that. Voodoo? My eyes shot up and I stared at him. Yeah, voodoo, he said. I like the voodoo that you do. Oh, come on. My voice went up a notch. She was not a voodoo woman, and you know it. I paused to look around, hoping to find the person responsible for this prank. Who put you up to this? No one put me up to this. No one put me up to anything, he said, a crestfallen look descending over his face. I swear. Really? I studied his features for any sign of deception, and I didn't find any, so I softened a little. Well, I find it a little odd that the very minute I'm reading about Louisville's voodoo past, someone with the voodoo ghost story should toss a stone through my window. Not only that, the guy who does the tossing is a Beauregard, and I happen to be reading about a Dr. Beauregard. Doc Beauregard? The voodoo doctor from New Orleans? He sounded impressed. Well, he was from Kentucky, actually, but yes, you've heard of him then? I said. Sure thing, he said. My mom's a tour guide down there, and she knows all that stuff. A moment's hesitation followed, and his brows knitted together in concentration. I sure hope she didn't name me after him. It would be a hoot if she had, I said. Oh, she wouldn't have done that, Beau said, not entirely convinced of the certainty of his claim. Not after a voodoo doctor. Well, maybe you should ask her, I said. He thought for a minute and furrowed his brow. Yeah, I think I will, he said finally. His head turned at the sound of a shopping cart being pushed along the sidewalk, and then he went back to the original topic of conversation. Hey, you want me to show you where I saw the ghost of the one-armed woman? At first, I planned on politely refusing his offer, but since it was time to take the dogs for a walk anyway, I agreed. I'm knocking over my lights. They had been patiently standing at the front entrance, looking out through the iron security doors during the entire exchange. Might as well, I said. Let me get the dogs and I'll be right out. 5 minutes later, we were headed south on 3rd Street. Even though summer had arrived, some of the leaves on the trees in the neighborhood had already started to tinge with rust, and the light from the street lamps glowed softly below the maple canopy overhead. As we walked, every now and then a leaf would loosen itself and waft down to dance at our feet before settling in among other random leaves on the sidewalk. Off in the distance, the rusty wheels of the shopping cart bumped their way over an uneven surface. Hey, have you seen that old woman who pushes around that cart full of sticks? Beau pointed down the road, presumably at the source of the noise. They say she's a witch. Well, so I've heard. I followed the dogs to the next street where we turned right. An imposing chateau-style mansion that had seen better days loomed on the corner, and the light at the front door flicked on and off 3 times before he lost it from our field of vision. You see that, Beau? Said. That was weird. Well, probably a short in the wire or something. Or probably some freak standing there at the front door trying to mess with us. That's more likely. He reached up, grabbed a hank of his long hair, and threw it back over his shoulder. Along a section of park, the lights on the street had apparently burnt out. We walked over the bumpy bricks in darkness until we reached 4th Street, spreading out to the left. Central Park was a dark expanse of towering trees that stood sentinel-like and silent. Before us, a large brick mansion, the Russell Houston mansion, which had been converted into the inn at the park bed and breakfast, basked in the shine of floodlights in the front yard. Here and there, bits of red stone trim added detail to an interesting assortment of arches, gables, and hidden balconies. On the top floor, a dark shadow blocked out the light as it seemed to approach a lone dormer window and peer down at us. I wondered if it was Annie Whipple, the former tutor of the children of the house whose ghost was rumored to haunt the mansion. We crossed the street and turned right at the sidewalk, Beau running ahead of me. It was right here, he said, as he approached a spot on the walkway in front of the Women's Club of Louisville. I was walking down the way we just came, and all of a sudden I looked up and saw this form floating down the sidewalk right at me. His arms dropped to the side, and he assumed a vacant, zombie-like stare before slowly, simulating toward me. That's how she moved, he said. Except she was missing an arm. He pointed to his left side and smiled. Creepy, huh? Yeah, that sounds creepy, all right, I said. How long ago did you see her? I turned around and studied the rest of the structures, all of them stone and brick, that lined the street. Bo flicked another long strand of hair behind his ear and thought for a moment. Oh, it seemed like a really long time while it was happening, but it's probably 5 or 10 seconds, somewhere around there. He flicked a strand of hair behind his other ear and pretended to float down the sidewalk again. Do you know of anyone else who's seen this apparition? I asked, moving out of the way so he could float past me. It helps when there's more than one witness to talk to. Yeah, my roommate's mother has seen her, he said. I'll give you his email so you can talk to him if you like. I watched as Bo fake floated down to the end of the block, turned, and floated back to where I was standing. He handed me a scrap of paper with some ink scratches on it. You can reach him there. Suddenly, a strange bleating noise reverberated in the darkness. Hey, man, what's that? Bo stopped and gave me a quizzical look. Beats me, I said. It sounded something like goats or sheep. Bleh, bleh, bleh. This time, the bleat sounded nearer, so I turned my ear toward the noise, which seemed to come from between the two houses nearest us. Man, we don't got livestock in old Louisville, do we? Asked Bo. He was wide-eyed. It wouldn't surprise me, I said dryly. I've seen goofier things down here. Saw a wild turkey not too long ago. Bleh, bleh, bleh. The swift clip of small hooves on cement echoed between the houses, and a small dark form emerged, driven forward by a vague figure in white that materialized in the driveway of the Fraser house. Bleh, bleh, bleh. It was a young goat, its coat a silvery black that glistened in the moonlight, and it ran to the end of the drive and turned toward us. Behind it followed a figure clad in white, a long staff clunking hollowly on the sidewalk as they made their way in our direction. Fritz and Rocky had spotted the goat and began barking, so I pulled them back and quieted them. Without so much as a glance in our direction, the goat passed by Bo and me and beelined it to the next corner. Several seconds after that, the figure in white reached us and walked by without a word. She wore an enormous, snowy white turban that concealed much of her face in shadows. Even before the light of the moon filtered through the leafy canopy overhead and washed over the woman's features, I had a suspicion that it was Josephine. Whoa! Bo watched as she caught up to the goat at the corner with Ormsby Avenue and then turned left. She looks like one of them Haitian voodoo women, wearing the white turban and that white dress like that, and holding that staff out in front of her like she's a shepherdess or something. He shook his head and looked at me. Like I said, you see it all down here in old Louisville. We watched as Josephine and the goat rounded the corner and disappeared from sight. Silently, I prayed that the unsuspecting creature would not end up the star attraction at some gruesome full moon voodoo ritual later that night, or in some spicy curry on an old Louisville dinner table. You know her or something? Asked Bo. He had taken a stone from a pocket and was tossing it back and forth from one palm to the other. You didn't seem that surprised to see her. Well, I wouldn't really say I know her, but I've seen her around before, if that was her, but I couldn't really see her face. Off in the distance, I could hear a faint bleating. They say she's some kind of voodoo queen or doctor. Her name's supposed to be Josephine. Bo stopped tossing his stone, and it fell and clattered to the sidewalk and bounced into the grass. Did you say her name was Josephine? Well, I don't know for sure, I said, but that's what people call her. This neighborhood is full of so many oddballs, though. You never know who's real and who's the figment of somebody's imagination. Bo continued to stare at me with a wide-eyed expression. The dog stared at me as well, wondering what our next destination would be. This is so freaky, man, Bo said, because you made me remember something about the ghost with the one arm I was telling you about. What's that? My ear strained as the distant bleating noise increased in volume. I remembered something my roommate's mom told me about that ghost. She said her name was Josephine, and that she was a witch doctor or something like that. But before there was time for the coincidence to sink in and make me shudder, something struck me from behind and knocked me to the pavement. End of that chapter. Cliffhanger. So tune in tomorrow night and we see what it was that knocked me down on the sidewalk on 6th Street. So thanks again, everyone, for tuning in. Love seeing you every night. Thanks for the regulars. Glad to see some new faces tonight. Come back tomorrow night. Bring your friends. We got another good week or 10 days. We're working our way through this. And we'll have to see what happens when we're done. But hope you're all doing well. If you're just checking in, once again, tell people where you're from. Say hi. Say how you know me. Say how you know your friends here. I like to see people coming back, bringing their friends. Thanks to Matt for dropping off a bottle of Angel's Envy tonight. Hope you had a good evening. And hang in there. We got another day under our belts. So tomorrow night will be another one. So look forward to seeing you at 9 o'clock. Bring some friends and we'll continue Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa. So take care. Love you all. Send me messages. I the messages and comment on all the comments I get, or at least like them. So thanks for checking in, and love seeing you all every night. We'll see you tomorrow night. So love you all. Bye.